scripture reading this morning is going to come out of Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22, I'm going to read, Matthew 14. I'm jumping ahead. Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33. And this will not be a Father's Day sermon, if that's what you were wanting or expecting or hoping. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I kind of look at the calendar until we take often 6 weeks for Lent and 6 weeks for Advent, and then you throw in a couple other days, then we only have about 3/4 of the days left in the church year, and I've got too many things to preach on. And so we're going somewhere else this morning. We're actually going to Jesus walking on the water. And so reading out of Matthew 14, starting with verse 22, it says, "Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way away from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It's a ghost!' And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take heart, it is I, don't be afraid.' And Peter said, 'Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water.' He said, 'Come.' So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, 'Lord, save me!' Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, 'Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?' And when he got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" We'll dismiss the children to go downstairs for their time down there. So anyone who wants to join them is welcome to go. You have all probably heard that account before, right? The account of Jesus walking on the water. You've probably read it multiple times. You've probably heard it multiple times. You've probably heard multiple sermons on it. And this is a passage that it's often used to talk about Peter's faith, right? Peter got out of the boat in the middle of a storm and he walked on water. Right? That's amazing. And we hear that. And then we put a little asterisk beside Peter's name because then he had this lack of faith and started to sink. I'm like, whoa, what's with that? There were 11 people that never got out of the boat. And I venture to say that if we had been in that boat, if we had been in that storm, that we probably wouldn't gotten out of the boat either. But interestingly, this account of Jesus walking on the water, it's in 3 of the 4 Gospels. So 3 of the Gospel writers include it, and only one of them talks about Peter. Only one of them talks about Peter getting out of the boat. The others just talk about Jesus walking on the water. And so this morning, while I read the account with Peter, my sermon is actually going to come out of Mark's account, Mark chapter 6. So if you have your Bibles and you want to turn to that, I encourage you to do so. I will have most of the passages up on the screens as well. But while you're finding that, there's 2 questions that I am continually asking myself. I'm asking myself, what is it that I am trying to achieve? And is this the best way of doing that? And so in all areas, I'm asking myself, what is it that I'm really trying to do? What am I trying to accomplish? And is this the best way of doing that? Because I find out that sometimes I don't even know what I'm really trying to do. And often when I step back, I look at it and I say, that's probably not the best way of doing it. And we can do that we can do that here at church. We're remodeling the basement right now, right? What is it we're really trying to achieve? I don't think we just want to have a nicer kitchen. That's not the end goal, right? There's some goal beyond it. What is it that we're trying to achieve? And then once we define that, then we say, is redoing the kitchen really the best way to do that? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for redoing the basement, right? This isn't about, we could ask the same thing about Sunday school. What is the purpose of Sunday school? What do we really want to get out of it? And then once we've defined that, then say, okay, if that is our goal, is Sunday school really the best way of doing that? It's just a little different way of thinking. We could ask it with Vacation Bible School. What is the purpose? We're putting a whole ton of effort into VBS this week, and we have been getting up to it, putting a lot of effort into it. Why? What's the purpose? What do we really want to accomplish? And see, I don't really care what we define that purpose is, just that we define the purpose. Is Bible school daycare for our kids for a few hours so that the parents can not have the kids around? Maybe. Is the purpose of Bible school to give the children of our church some deeper religious training, right? Some things that we don't have time for in Sunday school, so we take this week, right? Maybe that's our purpose. Or is the vocation of the purpose of VBS, is it outreach to the community? Is it to share the gospel with those who are not normally inside these four walls? To encourage them in their faith, to encourage them maybe to join our church or another church. But see, once we define that goal, then we have to step back and say, well, if that's what we're really trying to do, if we're trying to provide daycare for a few hours each week, is VBS the best way of doing this? If we're trying to do some deeper teaching of our children that attend here, is VBS the best way to do that? Or if we say that's really what we want to do, but then, well, what's the best way? Or if the purpose of VBS is to reach out to the community, right? If it's community outreach, then again, if that's our goal, is VBS the best way of doing that? Because I find for myself that often it's not, and I don't get me wrong, I love VBS. I hope that we keep doing it. But the question is, if our goal is doing something that we've been doing since probably the 1950s, that we've been doing for basically the same for 75 years, is that the best way of achieving that result in 2026? It's something to think about. And I ask myself that all the time. What am I actually trying to accomplish? And is this the best way? I ask it in my personal life. I ask it in my work life. I ask it in my spiritual life. What am I trying to accomplish? And really getting that defined, because when we define that, it determines how we do things. If we're going to have VBS, and if it's daycare, we approach it one way. If it's for the kids in our own church, we approach it another way. If it's outreach for the community, we approach it a different way. It's important to know what our purpose is. And the reason I bring this up is I think that Jesus, when he was here on earth, he knew exactly what he was trying to accomplish. And the different things he did, I mean, overall in his life, obviously, we know what he was trying to accomplish, right? He was trying to bring salvation, trying to restore us to the Father. But I think in the little things that he did, I think he knew exactly what he was trying to accomplish. And I think he was using the best way of doing that. So there was a reason. And I think that's going to come into play in this passage this morning. So some quick background to Jesus walking on the water. This day, it starts out with Jesus getting word that John the Baptist has been executed. Right? John the Baptist had been killed. And I'm sure for Jesus, that was something to think about, right? When someone close to us dies or is killed, it kind of hits us, right? We got to step back. It's like, makes us think. Yesterday, I got word that a classmate of mine from Peru, I can't even call her a close friend. I haven't seen her in probably close to 50 years, but a classmate of mine passed away from cancer. And it took me a few minutes to kind of get my composure back. And I wasn't even close to her. But Jesus, he was related to John the Baptist. They had the same mission. They had the same message. And so all of a sudden, Jesus gets word that John the Baptist has been executed. And I'm sure in Jesus' mind, he's thinking, my day's coming. Right? We're preaching the same message. And so Jesus, he starts out the day like that. His disciples are with him. some of his disciples, we were talking about in Sunday school this morning, Andrew was actually one of John the Baptist's disciples before coming to Jesus. So here's Andrew along with the other disciples going, wait, I was close to John, right? He was my rabbi. He's who I was following. And so they're struggling with this turmoil. Jesus says, we need to get away. We need some R&R. We need to be able to go and process this. You guys, let's get in the boat. Take me to the other side of the lake. So they get in the boat and they go to the other side of the lake. Now, the people that they were ministering to there, they're like, well, they don't want Jesus to leave, right? They figure out he's going to the other side of the lake. They start walking around the lake. Maybe they're running around the lake. Maybe they're gathering other people as they go. When Jesus and his disciples, they're going to get some peace and quiet, to be alone, to process John's death, right? They pull up on this little rocky shore. There's no dock. There's no town. They're in the middle of nowhere. They pull the boat up on shore, and there's a mass of people waiting for them. They had gone for peace and quiet. They'd gone to get away from the crowd. And here's probably a bigger crowd than when they started. And so Jesus, he ministers to them. He teaches them. He shares with them. It gets late. Remember, this is all the same day. It's starting to get late. The people are hungry. How are we going to feed these people? Oh, we don't have much. We have 5 loaves and 2 fish. Is that right? Or is it 2 loaves and 5? Got 5 and 2 with fish and bread. I don't remember which is which. Jesus takes those and he feeds this group of people. He feeds 5,000 people. That's how large this group was that had congregated in the middle of nowhere. It says 5,000 men. So there could have well been, include women, include children, could have been 10, 15, maybe 20,000 people are there on the shore when Jesus was going to get some peace and quiet. And so Jesus, he feeds the 5,000. He's ready to send the people away. He's ready to finally get his peace and quiet. And that's where we finally pick up in this chapter. After John's death, after Jesus goes for peace and quiet, after Jesus feeds the 5,000. Mark 6, starting in verse 45, says, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, back to where they came from, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. Interesting, it's almost word for word as what Matthew records. Matthew would say, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. So Jesus is finally alone. He's finally alone and he's praying. And a storm comes up. This storm comes up, this high wind. And I wonder if that's why the urgency at the beginning of this, that's why it says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat. Did Jesus know the storm was coming? Did he see a storm coming? Did they? Some of them they made their living on the water. And so it's like, hey, you guys need to get in the boat. You need to get moved. You need to beat this storm. I know on more than one occasion growing up, we lived along a lake when I was young in Peru. And across the lake, the lake was about a half mile wide. On the other side of the lake was Treasure Island. We loved to go to Treasure Island. It wasn't an island. It was a peninsula. Half the year in the rainy season, it wasn't even an island. It was underwater. But it was just far enough away from home that it was fun. And so as 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, whatever, we would get in a dugout canoe and we would cross the lake and we would go fishing and we would go swimming and we would do whatever we wanted to as 8, 10, and 12-year-old kids. And on more than one occasion, there was a storm coming and we were totally oblivious to it. Now, just so you remember, a dugout canoe has about that much freeboard. You are right at the water level. So when the waves start getting a little bit higher, they start coming in the boat pretty quick. And on more than one occasion, we would be paddling home and the boat would fill up with water and we would capsize and we'd be hanging onto the dugout canoe and we'd be working our way back home. See, you don't want to be on the lake in a storm. And that's where the disciples were. And Jesus was praying. Now, it's kind of interesting in Mark. Mark actually records 3 times where Jesus prayed. Mark records 3 times where Jesus prayed. The first is early in Mark. I think it's in chapter 1, but he says Jesus would rise early in the morning and go to a desolate place while it was still dark to pray. I think we might have just mentioned that a month ago in Bible study or in Sunday school here. That's one time when Jesus was praying. Another time when Jesus was praying was in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he was there with the disciples, and he left the disciples, and it says he went on a little bit farther and he prayed. And then there's this time. It's just kind of interesting. The 3 times that Mark records Jesus is praying are all at night, and Jesus is alone. That's the case here. He'd sent the disciples away. He'd dismissed the crowds, and he had finally found this quiet place where he was alone and could talk to the Father. And then continuing in verse 48, it says, and he saw they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. As he's praying, Jesus is seeing the disciples, and their progress is slow. Now, other translations add a little more oomph to this. They say they were distressed, they were straining, they were struggled, they were struggling, they were troubled, they were tormented. Essentially, they're in a world of hurt, right? These guys are in this boat. The wind has picked up, right? They were trying to beat the storm across the lake, and now they're being battered by it. They're working like mad. They're straining at the oars. They're rowing together. They're working. They're tired. And they're not getting any closer to land because it's one stroke forward, wind pushes you back. And Jesus saw them. And I find that encouraging. That in the middle of the storm, in the darkness, when they felt alone and helpless, he saw them. And about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. And this is great, but why? Why was Jesus walking on the water? Remember the questions I asked. What was he trying to achieve, and what was the best way of doing it? So if Jesus is walking on the water, there's something that he was trying to achieve, and walking on the water was the best way of doing it. So think about it for a moment. What was Jesus trying to achieve by walking on the water? And don't give me the churchy answers, right? Well, he was going to go reveal himself to the disciples. No, what was Jesus really trying to do that walking on the water was the absolute best way of doing it? Because there were other ways he could have crossed the lake. I mean, the easiest one, he could have got in the boat with the disciples. Right? He didn't need to dismiss the crowds. He'd already left the crowds earlier when he went around to this side of the lake. They'd found their way here. They could find their way home. Jesus could have just got in the boat with the disciples. There may have been other boats that would have followed him across the lake, right? The people were walking around, but there might have been some people in boats that followed him. He maybe could have got in one of their boats. Practically, Jesus could have walked back with the people. Right? They had already walked there, the several miles that it was. He could have walked back with them. It was actually the people, they left when Jesus was leaving in the boat. They beat him to the other side. Now the disciples are out in the boat, in the water. The wind is pushing them back, so they're not getting anywhere. If Jesus wanted to get back to where he started from, he could have walked back, and it would have been faster to go around the lake on the trail than it would have been to go in the boat. So what was it that Jesus, what objective did he have? What was he trying to show us that walking on the water was the best way of doing? That's what I want to know more of. But in the next part of the verse, it says, he meant to pass them by. Catch that? Why? What is with that? I use a lot of different Bibles, and most of my Bibles have that underlined with a question mark or comment by it, because what do you mean Jesus was going to pass them by? That's not very Jesus-y to me. Right? I don't want Jesus to ignore me. And if his intent was just to get to the other side, and so he was just going to go and walk by these guys, Why didn't he just go around on land and avoid all of it together? I can't think of any reason that Jesus would have just walked on the water. Jesus never used his powers for his own convenience and benefit, right? So if he was going to walk on water, it wasn't for him. If he just needed to get to the other side, he would have found a different way to get there. So the fact that he's walking on water, there was something for somebody else in that. And so we're trying to figure that out. Like I said, it would have been faster to walk around. We know that the people they ran around. And so if Jesus wanted to get to the other side of the lake, especially considering the storm, there would have been other ways that he could have done that. He'd already calmed the storm, right? He didn't need to show the disciples that. Earlier in Mark, Jesus has calmed the storm. Jesus has healed people. He's healed blind people. He's healed lame people, right? He just finished turning a Happy Meal into food for 10 or 15,000 people, right? He didn't need to show the disciples his power. So why in the world was Jesus walking on the water, and why did he mean to pass them by? And I've struggled with that. I've struggled with this because it just doesn't seem like Jesus. His disciples are out there in the storm, right? I'm going to say storm a lot because I think it was a storm. If you look at it, it says a strong wind or a gale or something. I think it was a storm, right? They're out there, the waves crashing up on the boat. They're getting wet. It's dark. They're working hard. They're struggling. And Jesus, why would he just pass them by? And the wording is that he intended to pass them by. It's not like Jesus was walking along and it's like, oh, well, they're over there, but I'm focused on this. No, his whole intent was not to stop. If you read it that way, his intent was to pass them by. And so back to my question. If Jesus was using the best means possible to accomplish his goal, what in the world was his goal? What was passing by the disciples the best way of achieving? And then I heard something and it clicked and things began to fall in place. Anybody remember in the First Testament, in the Old Testament, if you will, who God passed by? That's one of them. There were two people that God passed by, right? Two people who did not walk on the water, but two of the four people in the First Testament who parted the water, walked through the water. Moses and Elijah. Two people who Jesus later would meet at the Mount on Transfiguration, right? Along with Peter, James, and John. God passed by Moses and Elijah. Moses was frustrated with the people. Who wouldn't have been, right? Moses was frustrated with people, and he wanted to see God's glory. He's like, show me who you are. Show me this. And in Exodus chapter 33, God said to him, behold, there's a place by me where you shall stand on the rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hands away, and you shall see my back, but my face you shall not see. See, God passed by Moses to reveal himself to him, to reveal to Moses who he really was. The same thing with Elijah. Elijah's feeling sorry for himself. He's had it rough. And God said, go out. He's hiding in a cave. God says, go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by. And there was thunder, and there was lightning, and there was an earthquake, and there was fire. And God revealed himself to Elijah. Now, interestingly, in Sunday school this morning, we're sitting there, and all of a sudden I get an elbow in the ribs because we're looking at John, and Jesus passed by John the Baptist. And what did John do? John revealed who he was. Behold, the Lamb of God. When Jesus passes by, when God passed by, it is to reveal who he is. And so when Jesus went to pass by the disciples, he wasn't trying to ignore them. He wasn't avoiding them. He was intent on revealing himself to them. See, because walking on water was something that was understood that only God could do. Moses, Elijah, they didn't walk on water. They parted the water. The thought of the people at the time was that only God can walk on water. Job, in his turmoil, Job is writing and he's describing God. And he says that God alone stretched out the heaven and trampled the waves of the sea. You don't trample the waves by sinking into them, right? If you're trampling something, you're stomping on it. You are on top of it. You are smashing it. And Job is saying God is on top of the water. He's walking on the water. God tramples the water. That's the characteristic of God. God's in control of it. Psalm 77 refers to God having a path through the water and unseen footprints. Isaiah 43 also talks about God making his way through the sea and a mighty path in the water. So Jesus, by walking on the water, was showing something that only God could do. He was indicating that he was God. And his passing by the disciples was not being mean. He wasn't ignoring them in their plight. Rather, he was revealing his true identity to them. He was allowing them to see not just his humanness, but his godliness, his divinity. And isn't that encouraging? Remember, Jesus sent them into the storm. He sent them into the storm. And then he saw them in the storm. And then he went to them in the storm and he revealed himself to them, all in the storm. But they weren't ready for him. Because continuing in verse 49, when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost and they cried out because they saw him and were terrified. Not too surprising, right? They were disciples. Remember this, they were exhausted. Remember what happened this day. Starts out word that John the Baptist had been executed. Then they row across the lake. Now they're outside in the sun all day long, right? They were trying to make sense of all of this mentally, right? Mentally, how do you make sense of John the Baptist being killed? He and Jesus were like on the same team. And what's that going to mean for Jesus? And what's that going to mean for us? And so they're trying to make sense of that. Then they were trying to make sense of this whole feeding of the 5,000 or 10,000 or 15,000. And that would have been exhausting too. I mean, say that there were 15,000 people. That's about how many people Hawkeye Carver Arena holds. All right, many of you have been there for a sporting event. Now imagine Jesus is sitting at center court and he has the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and he starts breaking them and he hands you a basket. And so you go to Jesus and he fills this up with fish and bread. And you go to section A, to row 1, and you pass it down. And by the time it gets to the end of row 1, in section A, it's empty. And so you take the basket and you go back to Jesus at center court. And he breaks some more fish and bread into it. And you go back to section A to row 2, and you pass it down. And it's empty. And you go back to Jesus and he fills up the basket again. Now, if I remember right, there's 44 rows in Hawkeye Carver Arena. And as you're going up, you get up to about row 20, and you pass the basket down, and it no longer makes it all the way down. It goes halfway, and it's empty. So now you got to go back, and you got to do the same row twice. And you do that, and you finish row A. And then there's row B, or section B, and section C, all the way up to section MM, or section M, and then it starts at MM and goes all the way back down to AA. You got 12 guys taking baskets of food and feeding all of these people. They were tired. They were tired. And then Jesus tells them to get back in the boat and go home. It's between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning. They're out on the water. They'd been awake well over 20 hours, and they're caught in a storm. They're caught in the wind, maybe in rain. Right? The waves are hitting the boat, splashing them. They're soaked. They're tired. I imagine that it's dark. I imagine that it's a storm and there's thunder and lightning. They can't see the shore where they're going. They're just rowing blindly. And then the wind is howling, the waves are breaking, and then there's this flash of lightning, and one of them catches a glimpse of something off to the side. What was that? I saw something. Is it like a log with something on it? There's something over there. They can't see it because it's dark, and they're all looking. And there's another flash of light, and they see a man standing there. Don't know how far away, maybe 100 feet away, maybe 15 or 20 feet away. And there's Jesus, right? But they didn't recognize him. They were scared. Who wouldn't be, right? Is it something we're going to hit with the boat? Are we going to capsize? It's like, who? You can't walk on water. Who is that? They were terrified. They didn't recognize Jesus because they weren't looking for him. And so they're crying out in fear. And immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Jesus is doing two things here. He's addressing their fear, and he's declaring his identity. He's saying, take courage. Don't be afraid. How often do we need to hear those same words in our storms of life? It's not easy to put fear aside, but it's a lot easier if we know who Jesus is. And he told them, "It is I. It is I." Kind of similar to what God told Moses when Moses asked, "Well, who are you?" And he says, "I am. I am the God of Israel. I am the living God." Jesus is saying, "It is I, the living God who walks on the water." Jesus was not only doing what only God could do, he was taking on the name of God as well. And he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down, and they were completely amazed. Because they were in the storm until Jesus joined them in the boat. And once Jesus joined them in the boat, the storm dissipated. And Matthew, in the version I read earlier, says that they worshiped him. At that point, the disciples worshiped him, which is the only proper response to being in the presence of God. So what are the takeaways this morning? What do we learn? How do we apply this to our own lives when we face storms? Because someone has said that we're all either entering into a storm, in the middle of a storm, or just coming out of a storm. And sometimes in the church historically we have said that the storms and the turmoil and the tumult in our lives is a result of our own sin. And sometimes it is, right? Jonah went through some storms because of his own disobedience to God. And so if that is someone this morning, if you are going through storms because of the sin in your own life, man, come talk to me, talk to Pastor Richard. Let's get right with God again. Okay? If there's someone that's here or watching who has not made that commitment to follow Jesus, and you're going through these storms in life alone, come talk to us. Let us introduce you to Jesus. But sometimes, as in this case, Jesus has sent you into a storm. See, Jesus knew it was coming. He sent them immediately. Jesus knew the storm was coming, but he had something important to teach them. And he knew the best way to do that was to send them into the storm. And sometimes Jesus does that with us. He sends us into the storm, into a hopeless situation to show us something. But see, Jesus didn't send them into the storm and forget about them. He saw them. He saw them struggling. He saw them fighting the storm. He was looking out for them even when they didn't realize it, even when they couldn't see him. And so it's the same for us. No matter what storm we're in, whether it's of our own doing like Jonah, or whether it's a storm that Jesus has sent us into, he sees our struggles. And after he saw them, he went to them. He knew they were at their breaking point, and he approached them. And he does the same for us. He doesn't ignore us. Sometimes we don't see him because we're not looking. We don't expect him to show up. And sometimes we see him and it seems like he's passing us by, that he's leaving us in our struggles. But see, remember, it was in his passing by that Jesus revealed to the disciples who he really was. They weren't looking for him, but in the middle of the storm, he showed up and revealed himself. And then Jesus got into the boat. And when he did, Jesus didn't get into the boat as their rabbi. He didn't get into the boat as their teacher. He got into the boat as God of the universe, the creator who treads on water, the great I am. And the disciples worshiped him. This is the only time prior to the resurrection that the disciples worshiped Jesus. They followed him. They were with him. But it's the only time I could find where the disciples actually worshiped him prior to the resurrection, because it was at this point that they understood who he was, that he was God. So whether we are entering a storm, whether we are in the middle of a storm, or whether we are coming out of the storm, my prayer is that we see Jesus and not think that he is passing us by, but that we see that he is revealing himself to us.